Gentle readers, welcome to Everything is Everything. I'm Amit and this is my good friend Ajay. And if there's one thing you know about us, it is that we love firms, right? Firms are awesome, firms are amazing, firms are edifying, firms are illuminating, and when firms are sexually aroused, firms are firm. All right, I think first time ever he laughed at one of my jokes, but to be serious, we've done a bunch of episodes on firms in the past, and I've, collected them in the show notes as a collection of resources that you should really check out. Episode 21 was a history of finance, which at a foundational level, it's an episode I absolutely love. Then Ajay went on to tell us about family firms, how family firms can and should evolve, and the obvious answers may be wrong. After that, we've spoken about the different kinds of firms, from imperial to adaptive firms, when you should be central, when you should be more decentralized. And we've also spoken about the importance of internationalization or globalization. Ajay, I want you to say the word internationalization.
Internationalization.
But that's not how you say it. How do you say it?
I-18N.
There you go. I-18N. And everyone else also ate in N. So what are we talking about today?
Today we're going to talk about the death of firms. So, to take interest in firms is to take interest in birth and death. Schumpeterian creative destruction requires both. You need the creation of firms, you need Vishnu, and you need Shiv. Okay, so all three have to be there. Otherwise, the harmony of the world is incomplete.
You have weaved it skillfully into mythology. Am I sitting with Ajay Shah or am I sitting with my friend Devdutt Patnaik? Regardless, I'd like you to, before we get going with the subject of this episode, tell me, let's talk about the term creative destruction by Schumpeter. What does it mean to you? Why is it so important? Because typically a lay person who is not familiar with economics or the way society works would look at the term destruction and say, hey, that's a damn bad thing. But actually creative destruction is the very essence of life and the essence of the world. And in a sense, it is rebirth and recreation happening all of the time. So fits well into mythology as well.
Firms consume labor and capital and they organize them in certain ways. You should think of the ways of a firm as being the DNA of an organism. The DNA of the organism contains the instructions about how the atoms and the molecules are put together into a well-functioning creature. And it is easy to become emotional about a firm. It is easy to become emotional about a creature. But it can happen that that recipe is not a great one, or that the world moves on, the world changes. The great economist Joseph Schumpeter tells us a story where the process of progress, the process of innovation, the process of productivity change is critically connected to the birth and death of firms. He tells us a story that new ideas come, there are innovators, the innovators take risks and they create a temporary monopoly because they have a new idea. In time, others will copy the idea, but for a narrow period of time, they will get rent on their unique idea, which is their monopoly, and that the prospect of that rent motivates investments in research and business model innovation. And side by side with that, when these new ideas come along, there are old firms that are not able to keep up. There are old firms that are not able to compete and they go bankrupt and they go out of business. But when a firm goes out of business, in a way, the labor and the capital are not lost. They come back into the hands of other firms. So it's just like, the carbon and the hydrogen atoms inside you will go back into other forms of life. So there's a ceaseless concept of firm destruction and firm creation, and that's a normal and healthy part of society.
And I think of, and I'm thinking aloud here, but I think of two axioms that tie it all together for me. One of them is that the world is complex, and the other one is that the world is in flux. Things are changing all the time. Now, if you think about society, how do the needs of individuals within society get fulfilled? It cannot possibly happen through central planning because flux, because complexity, right? There have to be other processes which bring it about. We had also done a great episode on 4 papers that changed the world. One of them, of course, was a paper talking about firms. Another was Hayek's paper on the price system and how it works, a bottom-up way through which markets operate. And we fulfill each other's needs, and we fulfill each other's needs perhaps at an individual level, that you need some plumbing work and I'm a plumber, and perhaps at a broader level that I look around me and I think, oh, people in society want omelets for breakfast, and therefore there is a business in eggs, and should I make a business? And firms come up, and as long as you're fulfilling needs, you are profitable, and profit is a fantastic motive because everything is a positive sum game. There's mutual benefit everywhere. But at some point in time, if a firm gets complacent, then competition will come up and the firm will be in trouble. And the firms that keep adapting, they survive, they do well. What is adaptation? Adaptation is learning how to keep serving other people in society. It is such a fantastic incentive. And if you fail to adapt, then you should go out of business, because the labor and the resources that you have can be better used for other purposes within society. They should not be tied down. So this is sort of, I'm just thinking aloud and kind of
So a
paraphrasing.
great organizing principle is, can you teach an old dog new tricks? And you undoubtedly can to some extent, because, for example, Tata Steel of 2024 is unrecognizably different from the original Tata Steel of Jamshedji Tata. More power to them. It's great. And this kind of organizational transformation will not have taken place in many firms, and they should go out of business.
So, Ajay, even though we've covered some of this territory before, let's start at the very basics. What is a firm? What is equity? What is debt? How does the whole system function? Tell me about that.
So a firm starts with some capital by the shareholders, and the firm generally chooses to borrow some money. Borrowing can come either from financial creditors, or it can just be buying goods on credit. So you've rented the camera equipment for this show, but you've not yet paid for it. That's an operational credit. So it's tantamount to borrowing. There's no difference. Operational creditors and financial creditors are both creditors. So there is some money that has been brought in by the shareholders, and there is borrowed money. The way the concept of the company was invented in 15th, 16th century Europe was that the shareholders have control of the firm. They make all the decisions as long as they are servicing all their debts. As long as they service all their debts, they're in charge. The creditor has no say in how the firm works. The creditor has paid in 100 rupees and expects to get 110, that is 100 rupees with interest, after 1 year, and so on. So the creditor has no say on how the firm is run. The creditor has the right to demand, you gave me a contract, you were supposed to pay me so much, did you pay me so much? And all this is how the firm normally works. But when the firm fails to pay its creditors, at that point, the very concept of company law, the basic fundamental concept of a company, is that the creditors are able to go stand in front of a judge and demonstrate that this guy was supposed to pay me 110 and he did not. Note, the only thing to be demonstrated in front of a judge is that there was indeed a credit relationship and it was indeed a default. Other than that, the judge has no say. Okay. At this point, the shareholders get thrown out. They lose control of the company, and in general, they also get wiped out. They lose their equity capital. And now the creditors come in control of the company. So it's a very dramatic fact about the concept of a limited liability company, that shareholders are in charge of the company as long as they are meeting their dues. The day the shareholders fail to pay their dues, they're supposed to get thrown out and replaced by the creditors. This is the very basic concept of a limited liability company. And all too often in India, you're going to see me lament the lack of a commercial culture. Too many people in India don't understand these basics. These are definitional things in the words limited liability company. Our subject for discussion today, the bankruptcy process, is about the machinery, about how this happens. So far, I've been very high level, that something is supposed to happen. You're supposed to demonstrate that there was a credit default, and then the creditors get the control of the company and the shareholders are thrown out. We need to flesh this out. We need to make it institutions. So this is in the sense of North Williamson, that the institutions create conditions for people to enter into these complex contracts. And let's just pause to think about what happens in the balance sheet of a company. Imagine there's a company where there's 100 rupees of equity and 100 rupees of debt, and the firm defaulted on the 100 rupees of debt. Then you literally have to think that we're going to reconstruct this company under a brand new balance sheet where the equity guys are gone. and the creditors sort of are now an equity like play. They control the full company. So the concept of bankruptcy extends to a complete transformation of the balance sheet as defined by the law. It is that deep. It's not a small superficial thing. So it's impossible to think of the word company without all this machinery. And I just want to lodge my protest against mainstream Indian thinking about business and economics. That very often people become emotional and sentimental about a company, about its erstwhile shareholders, about the family that created the company. And no, right in 15th century, 16th century England, there was no sentimentalism around these things. These are the cold relationships between equity and debt.
So, Ajay, with your newfound interest in Hinduism, perhaps sparked by the
All your
episode we
fault.
did a while
Yeah,
back,
entirely your fault.
entirely my fault, you have invoked Vishnu and Shiva in the concept of finance. Kindly explain.
There is a very basic human instinct for all of us that we become sentimental. We tend to fall in love with an organization. We respect and value the contribution of the founders, very often in India, of a founding family. And we see this in very sentimental ways. And it is important to simultaneously assert the importance of the bankruptcy process as the Shiva, that there has to be a process of destruction as well. Both are first class creations. So, in Hindu philosophy, you have a creation, you have a preservation, and you have a destruction, and they are all vital. If you'd interfere with any one of them, the great balance of the universe would be disrupted. You need all three. And bankruptcy process is about the operations of the destruction. Now, how will the universe go into an imbalance if we don't have the process of destruction? I want to come at this in a couple of different ways. One is the concept of a zombie firm. Okay, so imagine I am a weak firm. I'm really not doing well. Okay, I'm running losses and my creditors are filling the holes. I'm failing to pay the creditors. Basically, this thing is going very badly. Now, in a reasonable, healthy capitalism, what ought to happen is the firm ought to go out of business. Suppose it doesn't go out of business. Suppose it is propped up using more and more debt, maybe because of the incentives of badly regulated banks who don't want to recognize that they have a problem on their hands, or maybe because the government is prodding the banks that no, I don't want this firm to go bankrupt. Okay, for whatever reason, if you keep this firm artificially alive, it is standing and it is competing with healthy firms. It is damaging the profit margin of healthy firms. So this is a very deep insight. These firms that are dead men walking are called zombie firms. By the way, by symmetry, the banks that are dead men walking are called zombie banks. Okay, and in a way, the single great insight of Japan in the bad years after 1986 is that Japan went through 30 years of misery because they had zombie banks which were keeping zombie firms aloft, and the presence of these zombies shatters profitability for everybody else. So you lose economic dynamism all around the country. The process of investment requires healthy firms that make money. The healthy firms should be profitable. If healthy firms are not profitable, how will they invest? If zombie firms are present, if uh, Air India or Jet Airways is artificially kept alive, it is selling tickets and it is driving down the prices of plane tickets, and it is harming the health of the high quality airlines like Vistara. Okay, so it is important to get the weak players out of the way, which creates conditions of profitability for the successful firms. And then those successful firms feel that, wow, this is working so well, we're making money, come, let's go invest more. So what we saw in Japan was that the bad firms were artificially kept alive, and they were artificially kept alive by bad banks. And this whole thing was orchestrated by the industrial policy of the Japanese Ministry of Finance and the MITI. And this whole thing went badly wrong. And in fact, it cost 30 years of economic dynamism in Japan. So this is one good way to see the cost to society of artificially keeping these bad firms alive. Another way to think about it is that imagine you're a promoter run company, okay, and that there is fair power in the hands of a founding family. Now the family, it's asymmetric information. The family always knows more than external persons. The family understands this company is going to get into trouble. what do they start doing? They start extracting cash. They start stealing cash from the company. It's entirely illegal, but it does happen in India. And there again, when you give more time, when you don't rapidly resolve difficulties, the family gets more time to extract cash. Whereas if you will move swiftly and resolve a firm when it gets into trouble, put it into the bankruptcy process rapidly, then you will rule out these kinds of scenarios. Another element of how we should think about this is that once a firm gets into trouble, it's a melting ice cube. Okay, things start going bad. So watch. The insiders know that things are going badly. Some key employees start leaving. The firm starts reneging on some of its suppliers. The suppliers start holding up the goods. Regular maintenance of machines is not done. Okay, once a firm starts getting into trouble, it's a melting ice cube. It rapidly falls apart. The wheels come off. Once again, it's a call for speed. So what you want in every healthy society is a high speed mechanism where there is an objective early warning about the malfunctioning of the firm, which leads to the bankruptcy process being kicked into action and rapidly resolving the firm. If maybe it gets sold off, maybe it gets shut down, we'll come to that in a moment. But we need these institutions, we need to respect the failure of a firm, the death of the firm, the bankruptcy process as a normal, healthy activity. It should not carry a stigma. So business failure is normal. All of us should be trying things that fail, right? The great Amit Varma always encourages creators that throw things at the wall. You never know what's going to work. Okay, that's the nature of the modern world. We should be taking risks. Firms should be going bankrupt. And when they go bankrupt, there should be a well-defined script about how these things will proceed after the after the default event.
So I told a creative friend of mine when he asked me for advice that, bro, you have to throw things at the wall if he was wanting to make a vlog. I said, throw things at the wall. 5 minutes later, he calls back and says the camera broke. So this is not always great advice. And speaking of Japan, Japan not only had zombie firms and zombie banks, they also made a lot of great zombie movies. And I am wondering if I should go back and look at them
With
and
new
see if,
eyes.
yeah, with new eyes, if there is great metaphorical art being created and we are taking it at surface value, dead man walking, axe in hand chopped off, ha ha ha. But actually, perhaps there's something deeper going on there.
Yeah. Long ago, there was a Percy Mystery Committee on Bombay as an international financial center, and there Percy and I were merrily bandying the word zombie bank around, and some people in the committee got very offended. They thought that this is a disrespectful word, whereas actually it's a technical word. I mean, in this field, zombie firms, zombie banks are technical terms that have been introduced in the research on Japan.
And my memory is pretty close to being a zombie, so I'm not quite sure of this. But I think the very first episode of The Seen and the Unseen we did was on zombie banks, and the second one was about finance in general. So, gentle readers, you should check them out also.
So a firm gets into trouble. How would we proceed? One worldview is liquidation. Okay, that a firm has a factory, it has an office, the creditors will come, they'll grab the factories, they'll grab the office, they'll sell it off. Now, that may be optimal. Most often, if you get there sufficiently early, okay, so remember I talked about a melting ice cube. If you get there soon enough, actually the value of the firm as a going concern is higher than the sum of the parts. It's not just a factory and the offices and the distributors. It is a whole bunch of people and processes and IT systems and the orchestration, the culture, the ability of those people to work together, external contracts, external relationships. All these add up to intangible capital, and in general, the intangible capital is worth quite a lot. So there can be firms where you came in late. When the bankruptcy process starts late, the intangible capital is destroyed. Then you want to just shut up and do a liquidation, sell the factory, sell the land for whatever it's worth. There's nothing there. But in general, we are always hoping that a bankruptcy process will commence sufficiently early. And when it commences sufficiently early, the firm is a going concern. Now you want to hang on to that going concern. So this is a very interesting tension in the bankruptcy process, that do we think there is value in this firm, that it should be protected as a going concern, or is it hopeless and you just want to take some of the pieces and liquidate them? And a central question of the bankruptcy process is how the creditors will arrive at this decision. And I'm going to come to that in a moment. But I just want to flag off this as the great decision of the bankruptcy process, that is there value in this company or not? Do we protect this company as a going concern? And what would be the pathway? That in that case, somebody else would come along and become the new shareholder of the company. He'd pay a chunk of money to the creditors and become the new shareholder, pick up the reins of the company, and now all the factory and the labor and the IT and all that is orchestrated by a new equity guy, and then it keeps going as a going concern. Or we just think, no, this is gone, this is too late. Now you want to sell the factory, you want to sell the land, you want to terminate all the workers, and remember, now it goes back into the society. The land that you free up belonging to the failed firm goes into the hands of other companies. It rejuvenates the land market of all the cities where the firm operated, and so on. I want to emphasize that this is not a value judgment. This is not any humanitarian notion that, oh, we should protect the company as a going concern. This is a business judgment. So the firm goes bankrupt, the equity guys are thrown out, the old management is thrown out. The creditors come in, they gain control of the firm. Now the creditors have to make a business judgment that if I liquidate the firm, will I get 40? And if I sell the firm as a going concern, will I get 70? And 70 is more than 40, so I should do liquidation. So I don't want to at all be moralistic about it, and that is one of the big mistakes that we make in India. We become very sentimental. We start using words like stakeholder. Okay, the word stakeholder is a sure sign of, feeble reasoning. What is needed here is cold business reasoning that, look, the firm went bankrupt. Now the creditors stand to make losses. They should evaluate these two choices. Is there a good buyer who will come along, value this as a going concern, pay me well, pay me 70, pay me 90, okay, so that I'm actually doing rather well? Or, no, I can't find that. The firm is so far gone, there is no reasonable person who will come up and offer a good price. Then yeah, let me just cut it up, sell the real estate, sell the machines, and I'll get 40. So in general, the liquidation value of a firm is not great, but it may not be possible to find a buyer to come in at a good price to take the firm as a going concern.
So here's a question. Let's say that I borrow 100 rupees to run a business. And then at some point I realize I'm not going to be able to pay it back, the business is going to fail. The natural tendency of many promoters in India, as you pointed out, would be that let's keep quiet about this. Let's just siphon off whatever money that we can. And then later on, when it goes down too bad for the creditors. How does one avoid this kind of situation?
So there is a step in the bankruptcy process that at the point of bankruptcy, uh, if the committee of creditors and the people overseeing the bankruptcy look inside the books, remember they've got control of the company, they look inside the books and they start seeing evidence of this kind of siphoning off, it is a criminal offense and you ought to be able to go after promoters. Now, that hasn't happened a whole lot and it is very difficult to create the institutions to do that correctly. But theoretically, this is one check that when the bankruptcy process commences, you've got new people who are in charge of the books and the records of the company, and they are supposed to look back and assess whether there was malfeasance and initiate action against the promoters. At a practical level, what also happens in India is promoters have a reputation. So you can do this a couple of times, you can't do this too much. Then the lenders wise up that these guys can't be trusted. So it is not true that lenders are completely stupid. The credit markets in India are medium foolish, they are not deeply foolish. So in time, the families that misbehave, the businesses that misbehave, the individuals that misbehave do suffer reputational damage, and over the long term, it does reshape their business possibilities.
So, Ajay, this also seems to me to be a little bit of a complex problem because often a firm will have many different creditors. Their interests will be different. Some will want as much as they can make immediately. Some will say, okay, can we play a longer game and think about it in a different way?
Yeah.
Is there a way for that process to work out and not degenerate into squabbling?
So what you described is very real, and my God, there is squabbling. Okay. To make matters worse, some creditors have given a loan to the firm where a collateral is one machine. Some creditors have given a loan to the firm where the collateral is the factory. So they can say, see, I'm taking my machine and going away, hell with you. You are the other creditors. You're saying, no, 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 we'll do better as a going concern. But the guy is playing a game. The guy is saying, see, you pay me well, then I will not disrupt your going concern. Okay. So the guys with secured credit effectively get bargaining power and they negotiate with the other creditors. Haan, tum karo. You do a going concern. If you are happy with a going concern, fine. But please understand, I have the ability to torpedo your attempt at keeping the firm as a going concern. So you got to pay me well. So I want my 100 and you guys figure out whatever else you want to do. This kind of jostling happens as it must. This is a world of business. There are many creditors. They have different kind of claims and contracts and seniority of the cash and all that. All this comes together in a negotiation. And the forum of negotiation in India, the legal word adopted is committee of creditors. Elsewhere in the world, these things evolved informally. One of these days, we will do a glorious conversation around the history of the bankruptcy process in the UK, where you learn to respect what makes an advanced economy. Okay, this is a little bit centrally planned. Okay, I'm embarrassed to say that words like committee of creditors are coming from the law.
Yeah, cock.
Yeah. And so the committee of creditors is supposed to argue about all this. They're supposed to haggle about terms which are their internal bargains about how we're going to proceed. And the way the law is structured, it needs a supermajority, meaning not just 51%, get 60% of the creditors to say yes, get 70% of the creditors to say yes. Economists write theoretical papers on what is the appropriate supermajority that should be there in a committee of creditors. Okay, but this haggling happens in the committee of creditors, and these are all the core questions that some people say, no, this is pointless, let's just cut it up and sell the pieces, and maybe they have good pieces. Some people say, no, we should try going concern. Some people argue, you're welcome to try going concern, but I have primacy because I can take away the core assets. And then they make a deal that, okay, we're going to try for going concern. You will get primacy. You'll get your first 100. After that, what is left over will come to me, like that. All these complex deals are made in the committee of creditors. You can imagine it requires really sophisticated business instincts and bargaining in the committee of creditors, which all too often doesn't happen in India because most financial firms in India are basically, a bureaucracy. They are regulated to death and they are a bureaucracy. It's very difficult to find business instincts and commercial culture in the employees of the financial firms. This is one of the choke points. But conceptually, this is what we want. What we want is a badass, commercially sophisticated committee of creditors that is able to view these risks and make deals and do negotiations and come up with a value maximizing answer.
So, what is the simplest way of looking at the process? Like, if you're going to do the liquidation, the question is how? Do you have an auction? Do you give it to the highest bidder? Do you disaggregate different components? This is a land, this is a machinery. How does one do that? And then, what happens to all of the intangibles like the value of the labor, the institutional knowledge, etc.,
So
etc.?
you use the word liquidation. If the liquidation was to be done, then you make a list of all the assets of the company and you say, I'm selling the office, I'm selling the machine, I'm selling the keyboard. Okay, and you just put it up for auction, not very complicated. But the whole complexity comes in the case where it's a going concern. Sometimes some buyers will come and offer you a simple all cash deal. Okay, fine. In that case, you're comparing multiple buyers for an all cash deal, and then it is indeed a simple auction. So you're saying that here, so and so firm is in trouble, and please come to me with an all cash deal, and I will select the highest all cash deal. In reality, there are a lot of good deals are not all cash deals. So now I want you to pause to just think about this concept. There was a company, he was supposed to be paying on his debts for 20 years more. Okay, a new guy comes and says, see, I'm a great manager. I'll pay these debts over the next 20 years. So on an NPV basis, you'll get 100. It's great. I'm paying 100. I'm paying you a very good price. All I'm saying is make me the manager. Now I'll control the company. Okay, so he could say, I'm going to step into the shoes of the old shareholders. You get rid of the old shareholders. And I make these promises that over these years, I'll be paying you so much cash. So now the offer is more complicated. And now you have to judge, do I trust this guy? Will they actually be able to turn around the company? It's again business judgment. So in India, the instinct has been to bureaucratize it. Okay, in the eyes of financial regulators and in the eyes of banks and other regulated persons, there is very little business instinct. There's very little commercial knowledge. So they try to reduce it into black and white, that we'll just have a procedure, we'll open these bids, we'll treat it like government procurement. But it is not a simple thing. You're actually going to weigh some, crazy person will make a bid saying, I'll pay you everything, trust me, I'll be a good manager. But that person has no track record. That person has actually failed several times in other businesses that they've tried. Somebody else comes along saying, see, I'm making no promises. I'll get you 80. but I will run this business and I am already in that industry. So I'll know how to do this. I'll be able to ally this company into my business. Now it's a qualitative judgment. And there's no running away from commercial judgment in the committee of creditors. And this is something which really is not happening in India, partly because our instincts are very bureaucratic, partly because the entire landscape is a centrally planned bureaucracy. The banks have very low business capability. The banks are bureaucracies. They're just discharging rules and procedures. They're not thinking. So what you really want is this kind of qualitative judgment and risk taking by the committee of creditors. That's what a good bankruptcy process has. And that's not easy to get under Indian conditions.
I want to ask you about what the Indian bankruptcy process was before you guys came into the picture. But even before that, here's a fundamental question. How does the rule of law play into this? Because my impression always has been, and many of my friends who are in business, who run businesses and factories and so on, will often tell me that, yeah, the rule of law is so absent that you have to account for the absence when you make deals. That, okay, in an advanced country, if a contract is broken, you can kind of enforce it, you can do stuff about it. Over here, you have to weigh the probabilities of that happening and then do the deals accordingly. And the friction this introduces and the fear this introduces, and what the lack of trust endangers, is that there's a huge opportunity cost. A lot of deals that could be happening simply don't happen.
Yeah. So I've already started complaining to you about the Indian environment where some of these things don't work. I'll come back more tangibly at choke points, at several points about how in the Indian environment some of these things have not worked well. And this is a part of our larger lament that you do anything in India in one field, you'll try to make progress. We have to factor in the difficulties of the broader environment, the invisible infrastructure, and find some B grade, C grade choice. It is not possible to get a perfect answer because there are too many malfunctioning pieces all around.
So Ajay, you've explained quite excellently the different kinds of problems that come up with the creditors, the different kind of deals that can be on the table, the choices you face, the squabbles that might happen, the competing interests. What does an ideal bankruptcy code look like which takes all of this into account and finds an optimal way to reconcile it?
So I've already put many of the pieces up, but let me just assemble them so that we are all crystal clear on what's going on. So there's a company, it has equity, it has debt. Debt can be either financial creditors or operational creditors. There's no disrespect for an operational creditor, that if you're a supplier, you sent raw materials to the company did not pay you, it's credit. There's no difference at all. So we should not disadvantage the operational creditors in any way. Okay, now a default takes place. So step one, the aggrieved person goes to the court. In this case, the court is the NCLT, the National Company Law Tribunal. And the only question at court is, was there a credit and was there a default? Nothing else. That's how it ought to be. Sometimes it isn't. Okay. But what ought to happen is within 1 to 3 days, this step should be done. That there was a credit and you didn't pay me. Okay. At that point, the bankruptcy process commences. What happens in the bankruptcy process? The power of the managers and the equity guys is thrown out. The creditors are brought together. So any one creditor goes to the NCLT, but the NCLT assembles all the creditors into a committee, which is called the Committee of Creditors, and they are given the powers of the equity guys under normal company law. And they are told, now you start the bankruptcy process. And in that bankruptcy process, what they are supposed to do is they are supposed to assess what are our choices. Do we liquidate? Do we bring in some new guy to keep the company going? And they judge these choices in a cold commercial way. Based on that, they decide. And then either they cut up the company into parts and they liquidate it, they sell off the assets, or they hand over control of the company to a new guy under a brand new balance sheet where the old equity is all gone. So there is a brand new balance sheet that's reconstructed under the notional value promised by the new guy, and it becomes an all equity company in the hands of the new guy, and we get going.
So this is theory. This is the way things should be. How have they been historically, especially in India?
Yeah. In the UK, a lot of the elements of the bankruptcy process evolved out of common sense and common law and good behavior by a variety of persons. The first codification of bankruptcy law in the UK actually came very late in the game. For hundreds of years, it was just going on as market practice. People did business with each other, and the self-organizing system groped and found these institutions. It's really quite remarkable. In India, in the bad old days, there was no bankruptcy process, which meant that you basically had no recourse, nothing. That if somebody defaulted on you, you had nothing. You had no ability to ask for anything. The first milestone was the SARFAESI Act, which was enacted in 2002. What it did was it created rights for a secured creditor. So if I give you a loan, you give me that pretty microphone as a collateral. So when you default on the loan, I'm able to go to the court and get the policeman, and we expropriate you of that microphone, because deal's a deal. You promised. If you fail to pay, you'll give me that microphone. Okay, that was done at SARFAESI 2002. And you can see the perverse dynamic that it takes you only towards liquidation. It will never keep the company as a going concern. And there was no uh, negotiation mechanism between the creditors for a collective solution where all the creditors come together. A weird thing happened in 2013. There was a new Companies Act. And I remember Monte Ahluwalia said to me that he was a cabinet member at the time. He was deputy chairman planning commission. And he spoke to the people in the Ministry of Company Affairs saying there should be chapters in the new Companies Act which are a full bankruptcy code with the negotiation process, with the collective action by creditors. And they assured him, yes, yes, we're going to do it. And in fact, it was not there. So when I first started these conversations with him, he said, are you sure it's not there in the Companies Act 2013? And I said, I have done my fair share of bedtime reading of the Companies Act, and there is some trivial winding up provisions, but there is no bankruptcy process in the Companies Act. And it took a long time for people to understand some of these basics. The next milestone was FSLRC, Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, led by Justice Sri Krishna, which worked from 2011 to 2015. Here, they got a full understanding of a certain specialized kind of bankruptcy, the bankruptcy of financial firms that have retail claimants like bank depositors or insurance policies. And they said there has to be a larger bankruptcy code. Somebody's got to do that. We are doing this much. Okay. So they built out that full piece of the legal machinery for banks and insurance companies where a specialized bankruptcy code was required. And that is a little more state led. I'll explain later as to why. And they said, guys, somebody's got to do this. And then I think in your seen and the unseen conversation with KP Krishnan, he tells the story that in 2015 in the budget speech, in the part A of the budget speech, there was a para from Ministry of Small and Medium Enterprises, which said that we will build a bankruptcy code for small companies. And Krishnan went to Jaitley with that and said, yeah, you could do that, but don't you think we could do bigger? Shall we do a full bankruptcy code? And Jaitley was like, do we have the ability? Do we have the teams? And Krishnan described the work of FSLRC, and he said, we've done big complex laws, large research teams, for the first time in India, world-class law drafting capabilities. And so, yeah, we can do these kinds of things. So inspired by FSLRC, there was a thing set up that is called the BLRC, the Bankruptcy, I don't remember what the LRC is.
Law,
Bankruptcy Law Reforms
regulation.
Committee, okay,
Okay.
BLRC. And this was led by the wise, old, experienced person from the world of Ministry of Law, T.K. Vishwanathan. Okay, and Susan and I were both members of the BLRC, and that's how the process began. And again, at the beginning of the BLRC, there was a very narrow vision that, oh, we'll do some amendments to the winding up provisions of the Companies Act. And it was really a while before people got the point that no, a bankruptcy code is something playing at a different level. It's a negotiation mechanism for the creditors, whereby the things that I described to you will happen. And Rajiv Maharishi became the secretary of the Department of Economic Affairs, and he supported and encouraged this more radical view that don't make do with the dinky, trivial refinements to the law, but go for a full bankruptcy code. And then Susan led the team that did a first draft of the code, which became a law in 2016. It's now called the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code.
So, I've discussed the bankruptcy code in the Seen and the Unseen episode with Bhargavi Zaveri, who was part of Susan's team in drafting it. I've discussed a little bit of it with you in the Seen Unseen episode we did together. And I know a fair bit of the inside story in terms of how it's came together. It's absolutely inspiring, serious analysts and thinkers and wonks coming together to craft this. But how did it work in the real world? What are the problems that it faced?
Yeah. So it is not true that everything is solved and India now has a great bankruptcy process. India has a C grade bankruptcy process. Okay, like it's there, and yeah, it's better to have it than not to have it, but it has many difficulties. So let's go through a couple of building blocks of the problems. The first class of problems is what I already alluded to earlier, that do you have employees of the Indian financial firms who are able to become a member of the committee of creditors and be fully badass and commercially oriented and exert their own judgment in choosing between rival resolution plans or liquidation, and be able to understand that, oh, this guy has the secured credit on this factory, so I have to pay him 100 because without him the going concern is impossible. That it is an advanced state of business thinking to be a member of the committee of creditors. The problem in India is that banking regulation works badly. Okay, so you've heard me talk many times about banking. Banks and banking in India are one of the weak spots of finance. For banks, there's really only one overriding objective, that how to hide the bad news. They just want to delay. They don't want to recognize that there is a problem. So a core insight in bankruptcy is a business has failed, the loss has already taken place. Now all we are debating is who is going to bear the loss, how will it play out. We're only discussing uh, the rights that take place at the end. But in the books of the bank, it's being carried at 100. And banks just want to do all they can to not recognize that a loss has taken place. The present crew wants to say, let somebody in the future think about it. So there's a profound flaw in banking regulation. Now, what you need is the kind of banking regulation that drives aggressive marking to market rules for banks. But we are not there yet.
Yeah, there's a term called the evergreening of loans, which
Correct.
is why if a bank wants to delay the bad news that,
Yeah.
your loan is bad, the company has failed,
Yeah.
you simply lend to the guy again so he
Yeah.
can pay off the previous loan, and it just goes on and it helps nobody. And when the incentives of the bank is to hide the bad news and to kick the can down the road, this is, the easiest thing in the world to do.
And now banks with those kinds of incentives are given a pivotal role on the committee of creditors. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to say, look, let's have a next meeting next month. They're not going to come into the situation with vim and vigor. The whole thing should be a couple of days. Instead, it drags out for months and years. And all the while, a bankrupt firm is a melting ice cube. So that's one thing that went wrong, that we just don't have the commercial culture of the creditors who are able to play the role that they're being asked to play.
So let's assume that there's a committee of creditors, a COC as it were, and you have three banks and two NBFCs there, and their representatives are on that committee, right? My question is this: let's say I'm a biscuit factory. I try to manufacture biscuits, but everything goes to hell, and I go into bankruptcy, and these five creditors are meeting three banks and three NBFCs. They don't know the first thing about the manufacturing industry or about biscuits or about this. So
Not
how do.
fair.
Hmm,
They gave a loan. They gave you 100 crore rupees.
correct. So
At
if.
that time, they're bloody well going to understand your industry. They're going to
Hmm.
understand you. So not fair to think they don't know.
So cool. If they knew enough to give that, then they know enough to now figure out what to do.
Ought to. They ought to know all these things. So you see, banks, NBFCs, private, public, FIIs, mutual funds, these are all different kind of characters. And I would generally expect that a private NBFC, a private bank, a mutual fund, an FII would be far more commercial, have the ability to think and just work with commercial common sense. But in general, banks and particularly PSU banks are less able to engage in commercial thinking. The PSU bank is also thinking of the CBI. The private bank is also thinking of the CBI. That if losses are made, will there be a future CBI investigation? I have to look good. So, they are painting the tape to look good in a future investigation. That's different from a commercial instinct. And look, you need a supermajority of the creditors. Banks are generally big enough to have an adverse impact upon the working of any committee of creditors. What banks like to do is to negotiate in darkness. They'll work with one creditor at a time, do a renegotiation, take a write down, but they don't want to do it in the aegis of the committee of creditors where it's actually more complicated, where they have to negotiate with all the others.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant.
So, given these constraints of India, you have to think in unorthodox ways. And one of my unorthodox ways, which is going to be very hard to persuade people about, is that until banking regulation figures out its act, the voting power of banks in the committee of creditors should be reduced, because the others are more commercial. A mutual fund is more commercial, an FII is more commercial, an NBFC is more commercial, an insurance company is more commercial. It is banks that are the problem. So, one day banks will get their act right, banking regulation will get its act right. In the meantime, maybe what you should do is give them less voting power in the committee of creditors.
And it's a structural question. It's a question of incentives, right? Banks have a particular kind of incentives, which is why, they become a problem here. The other guys who are pure commercial players, their incentive is wind it up as fast as possible. Don't delay the inevitable.
Similarly, operational creditors, your suppliers are great creditors. And there's been some real design mistakes in India that operational creditors are being shut off from the bankruptcy process. And that's not right. They are first class business people. They understand their interests and they will play for their interests.
So, Ajay, what happens to the promoter in all of this? Do they have a role once the bankruptcy process starts?
So the way India is structured, they don't. Okay, when the bankruptcy process starts, they're out of the game. The creditors will figure out what to do with the company. The promoters are out. There's been a great attempt at ensuring that the promoters cannot even bid to buy the company. Now, I think that's a mistake. So I think it's a healthy thing that it's a competitive process. Many people can come in with offers to the committee of creditors, and the promoter should be permitted to be one of them. Why? Because actually they have a lot of knowledge. They have a deep understanding of every corner of that business. So they'll probably give you a higher bid. Okay, so it's a very nice thing to have the promoters also competing in the bankruptcy process. But in India, it has been viewed that how can you have a man that ran the company down into the ground? How can you have them coming back into the bankruptcy process? And there has been a strong belief that you've got to just block all promoters, which I think is a bit unfair. There is another argument which I think makes more sense. Suppose promoters knew that they could bid to come back into their company. They could leave a whole bunch of poison pills inside the company that would deter any other bidders. That's a good argument. And the approach taken in India has been that promoters are completely blocked from bidding for the company in the face of the committee of creditors. So that's another awkward thing that has happened in India because of the broader difficulties of rule of law and the checks and balances and the fair play.
What's a poison pill?
Poison pill is where the promoter leaves messy things inside the company that she knows about, that she understands, that she will be able to diffuse once she is back in charge. But the new person will stumble on a landmine because they don't know what is going on.
Like a rat trap in the corner office under the chair, under the table.
Correct.
What correct? I'm joking.
It's literally what can be done. I
Okay.
mean, there can be all kinds of commercial contracts where there's one weird provision that is left in there where suddenly something bad happens and only the promoter knows. So if the promoter comes back, she's able to immediately diffuse those traps. But a new person comes in, they don't know about the traps, and 3 months later something horrible happens. And then the fear of that will keep everybody else out of bidding for the company.
Has this ever realistically happened? Because I would imagine that, yeah, in theory, you can bring up the scenario that it could happen like this. But in practice, I imagine the way most bankruptcies would happen and the way, this almost takes a lot of Machiavellian scheming to.
People respond to incentives. So we do need to think like this. I think this is a fair concern that you need to assume the worst. See, again, given Indian rule of law, these things ought to be criminal offenses and people ought to go to jail for that, but they don't. So now here we are. What you gonna do?
What you gonna do when they come for you?
So what is happening in India is the promoters are quietly sitting with the banks and renegotiating in secrecy. Okay, which is also not a great arrangement. It's not a market-based auction. So we are faced with these two extremes. that the banks are generally not keen on going into the IBC because it will reveal the bad news that they have been giving out these loans and they've got these bad assets. So the banks sit quietly with the promoters and keep on restructuring the loans under conditions of full secrecy. And when a bankruptcy process commences, the promoters are fully kept out. This is not a great arrangement, but that's where we are. Okay, the next group of problems is about the court. The court where these steps happen is called the NCLT, the National Company Law Tribunal. Now, by the law, there is no role for the court. The court is just supposed to do these basics. It is supposed to assess: 1, was there a credit? 2, was there a default? Bankruptcy process is initiated. Committee of creditors has come back saying we have a supermajority, we have an agreement on the plan. All that the court has to ascertain that, do you actually have a supermajority? Are you lying that you actually don't have a supermajority? Done. Okay, that's all. There's supposed to be nothing else. And all this ought to happen in weeks. This has gone wrong at 2 levels. The first is that the NCLT is like every other court in India, and the Indian legal system works fairly poorly. Okay, so there's a big field, there's a big journey on how to improve the Indian legal system, on how to improve the working of the judicial branch in India. But as at present, the NCLT works like any other court in India. Then the next piece we come to is a new regulator, which is called the IBBI, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. Here's the logic. The logic is that there may be many intricacies in the mechanism of the bankruptcy process. You don't want to code it all in parliamentary law. Okay? So at many places, the law envisages something more detailed that will be done through regulations. And there's supposed to be an expert body, that's the regulator, which will come up with those regulations and be able to rapidly evolve those regulations through time. Here, in the original draft of the law that was done by the technical expertise, for the first time in India's history, there was a whole machinery of an FSLRC quality treatment of how you build a regulatory organization in India. There are 140 sections that establish the checks and balances, separation of powers, governance, all the machinery of how you build a regulator was there in the original draft law. Unfortunately, it all got deleted. And some people just chose to cut and paste some 8 sections from the SEBI Act into the IBBI. So all the bad practices of how SEBI malfunctions were brought into IBBI. So there was really a lost opportunity to get a regulator right with the correct 140 sections of law. That opportunity was lost. And then you get the usual Indian state capability constraints. The IBBI again has a very narrow role, but there is a state capability problem on day one. They don't have the capabilities to discharge those roles. And it's very easy to engage in self-aggrandizing behavior where the regulator seeks a bigger role for itself, because it is the fundamental nature of government agencies that you want more power. So it's another piece which did not work out so well. And I just want to say, in a British common law system, it's not as if those regulations are codified by the government. They evolve as market practice. And we in India have just lost sight of the concept of a market economy. We are so coded into expecting everything to be written in laws and regulations. And everybody, the banks, will not work unless it's clearly written as a regulation. We've lost business common sense. What should be happening as ground up self-organizing system of creditors negotiating with creditors, coming up with contracts that meet their needs. We've just lost sight of that completely. We wait for the regulator. The regulator will write a regulation, then we will obey that. And then in the process, you're down to the quality of the regulator. And that one regulation may be a one size fits all, and it may not work too well. The next group of problems comes under the problems of the Indian non-rule of law, the corrupt environment. Okay, this whole dance involves many people who are supposed to be professional and commercial. The employees of the financial firms that sit on a committee of creditors are supposed to vote based on what is the best realization for their employer. And you sometimes worry that, are there other rival interests that are shaping their behavior? There's a critical person called an insolvency professional who's a bit of a maitre d' overseeing the entire working of the bankruptcy process. The insolvency professional can come under corrupt pressures. The promoters may often have incentives for doing certain bad things. And the larger context like the NCLT registry and others, there can be problems. So it is not a great situation where all this low rule of law is operating in the Indian environment, and it's not giving us great outcomes. And there is no real solution to that. Like, we have to go through 100 years of becoming an advanced economy, and these problems will get solved. But in the short term, there's really no answer. So these are all the problems and all the difficulties that I have described about how the bankruptcy code has not worked out great. And that doesn't mean it should not be done. And we need to do it better. We need to think more about the reform process, about how these things are done. But it is a B grade or a C grade project so far.
So, Ajay, it makes me deeply sad that something that you were involved in, that Susan was involved in, that Bhargavi was involved in, is today being dismissed by some random uncle as third rate. I do not like this. But jokes apart, what's the way forward? How could it get better in terms of the frames through which we think about it? How do we need to think differently?
So one very useful classification scheme in the world of public policy is that of inputs and outputs and outcomes. Okay, so for example, classic education setting, we talked about it. The inputs are the schools, the outputs are the grades that kids get at school or the teaching that is delivered at school. And the outcomes are actually learning, that we are doing all this for a reason, that we want the kids to learn. How would we apply that here? The inputs are a bankruptcy law, some NCLT, some creditors coming together in a committee. All that is the inputs. The outputs is a flow of bankruptcy cases where somebody goes bankrupt, goes to the NCLT, and there is some percentage of the money of the creditors that comes back to them. But the outcome that we want is a better working credit market where there are borrowers and there are lenders, and they play this smooth process because they all know that these are the rules of the game. So, your likelihood of defaulting changes when you know that this kind of threat is there at the end. This is where the glory of what we see in advanced economies. In advanced economies, most transactions are privately negotiated between the creditors and the shareholders under the threat of the law. So the term used is in the shadow of the law. Only a few cases go to court because you're not able to find the correct negotiation. Most cases, actually, the behavior of all counterparties is changed. So what you want as the outcome is a better commercial culture, better credit discipline where borrowers are keen to repay and then lenders are keen to lend. So, leverage in India should go up when the bankruptcy code comes in. And most disputes should get resolved in the shadow of the law through private negotiations. Okay, so that's a good classifying scheme, that we should not be satisfied with putting in inputs, and we should not judge it exclusively by the outputs. Ultimately, we're about outcomes. We've got to get to the outcomes. So what is that journey? How will it work out? How could it work out? The basic story is the same as what we told in our theory of change episode. In all issues in public policy, the theory of change is that there is a pipeline where there is data, there is research, there are multiple rival public policy proposals happening in the public domain. There is a criticism of the status quo happening in the public domain. And out of all that, we start getting to various legislative and executive actions where some things are done better. And you need that entire pipeline. So you need that flourishing ecosystem of data, of researchers, of a steady flow of research products coming out. So, it's an embarrassment that there's probably 2 papers in this field coming out a year. There ought to be like 20 papers on this field coming out every year. But we really don't have that kind of research community. And then you create the vibrant public discourse where there are people writing, criticizing, disagreeing, arguing with each other. And then out of that ferment, some joint secretary and some future minister will make better decisions. Also, criticism is key. If you don't have people criticizing the working of the bankruptcy code, you're fine. Like, why would any minister or any secretary make any changes? Because, we're fine. We've got our bankruptcy code. Everything is fine. So I think that at heart, this is about the theory of change, that for some time, it looked like there was a bankruptcy community in India where there were data sets and there were researchers and there were blog articles and research papers coming out, and there were newspaper op-eds criticizing this and criticizing that. And then, as with so many other elements of the Indian economic reform, that period ended and that community dissipated, and we've just broken down this entire pipeline, that we don't make data sets, we don't have researchers, we don't have a steady flow of working papers and blog articles, we don't get op-eds criticizing what is being done. So, then nothing will ever get fixed.
So, for me, the key phrase in all of this, which really sums up, I think, the big learning of this episode, is in the shadow of the law. And an important realization for me over a period of time is that when you use a phrase like that, in the shadow of the law, what you mean by the law is not just a statute that is written on paper. It involves the entire invisible infrastructure, as you might say, that what is the state capability, what is going to get enforced, what is a reasonable expectation on the creditor and the promoter that, hey, the law is going to work as intended. And unless all of that is in place, just writing a great law doesn't make sense. And therefore, what happens is that it is, in a sense, turtles all the way down. That because the law is broken in these fundamental ways which go beyond the way in which the statute is written, what you then have is that the whole culture is affected by that. The bad commercial culture that you're talking about, the lack of trust, and all the unseen ways in which they hobble business and innovation and all of that. So, my question really then is that how do we change that? A lot of the talking that we've done is around what should a big bankruptcy law look like, but that is the words on paper. What does how does this whole system change so that we can turn this vicious cycle around?
So one is, if you narrowly wanted to run a bankruptcy reform, because finally, you have to do one thing at a time, you can't do all the things. If you had to run a bankruptcy reform, we should be seeing that the site of change includes the NCLT. Okay, that side by side with building a good bankruptcy law, and you need to actually build a good bankruptcy law, as opposed to like some version of a law that came out which has many problems in it. So you do need to get to a good bankruptcy law. You do need to make the NCLT work. You do need to make the IBBI work. You do need to nurture the data sets and the researchers which will go with you along the journey. It's not as if the day we pass the law, we inaugurate the IBBI, we're done. In fact, that's only the beginning, because now starts a process of iterative refinement where the data and the research and the researchers will keep the thing honest all along. And I think most people in India don't understand the importance of the knowledge ecosystem, that every area of work has to be ensconced in a successful knowledge ecosystem. Then and only then you get the diagnosis, you get the debates, you get the criticism, and then the people who are in charge of running the place have a better chance at getting some of these things right. We tend to think the secretary and the minister and the joint secretary will lead a reform, but they are not able to, because it is not their job to form knowledge. So knowledge ecosystems are something far different from the thought process and the capability. Or, for example, like there are a couple of policy support orgs in India who do consulting for the joint secretary and consulting for the secretary, but they are more in the nature of like an HR arrangement. It's a staffing arrangement that you get a young person that speaks perfect English to work for the joint secretary, and that's not going to give intellectual leadership. The people required to participate in the policy life have to have intellectual leadership, have to know more about these subjects than the joint secretary and the secretary. Then we're starting to get somewhere, because you're actually feeding new knowledge into the policy debates and the policy process. That's a narrow conception of the bankruptcy reform. And then let's go back 1991 to 2011. Why did so many things work out right? Answer: because so many things were being done at once. Okay, the project of fixing the capital controls was going on in parallel to fixing the equity market, was going on in parallel to opening up the software industry, was going on in parallel to opening the telecom industry, and all these things reinforced each other. So when many policy projects are moving, it's actually a virtuous cycle. It strengthens everything. Whereas when we are in a more difficult environment where only a few policy projects are being done, there is less of that positive feedback. So there should have been a vibrant financial sector reforms journey going on in parallel here, whereby the banking regulation was getting fixed, but that wasn't happening. So we got banks as poor actors in the bankruptcy reform, and that had far-reaching consequences.
So I have three propositions and tell me what you feel about them. The first of them, pretty obvious, you should only judge a policy or a law by its outcome. The second is that there is nothing called a good law or a good policy in a vacuum. You have to see the society it's in, you have to see the supporting infrastructure, state capability, all of those things. If you do not take them into account, then it simply doesn't work. It's pointless to say this is good or this is bad. You have to take the real world into account. And my third proposition, therefore, is that some reforms are more important than others, in the sense that this invisible infrastructure that you talk about, which run across all these different sectors, it is critical to sort that out first. In the 91 to 2011 journey, as you pointed out, there was work happening on a lot of those. So you could do an arcane reform on a subject somewhere on the side, but because you were simultaneously reforming the bureaucracy and reforming the machinery, it could actually take place. So would you broadly agree with these three?
I want to say this slightly differently, that imagine you get a pretty good law done, but the invisible infrastructure is lacking. Then it will perform weakly today, but we hope that as other pieces fall into place, that same law will get us better. That can happen. Or we should be thinking, no, this is not going to work. That this kind of good law would function poorly given this invisible infrastructure, and then we should settle for a compromise which is less good compared to the good law. So these are trade-offs to make. And the second is, uh, uh, it is precisely correct that some things are more fundamental than others. We should not be pushing all areas with equal intensity, meaning some areas are more interesting and more important than others. And the way Vijay Kelkar and I like to think about it is, we like to zero base and say, give me a list of the elements of the state, of public policy, that are essential for civilization, that without that you will be in barbarism. So come to me with ideas that are just absolutely fundamental. Without that, there can be no possibility of civilization and a market economy. And so we will start. You will need a foreign policy, you will need military, you will probably need a fiat money, okay? You'll need a criminal justice system, you'll need police and courts, okay, like that. Think of a few things. And then to pay for these, we'll need a tax system, and we'll need some commercial law and some financial regulation. So we think of these as just the primal foundations that get these basics right, because after that you can think of more complex other fields. There are many other fields that tend to push their own priority. Oftentimes there's a humanitarian perspective that, oh, health is so important. But actually, in sequence, these are the fundamental pillars of a country that need to come into place first.
Everything falls apart if you don't get these right.
And we can't do everything. So, this idea that state capability, the reformers of the country, the intellectuals of the country, the researchers and the data sets of the country, the philanthropic capital of the country, these are very limited. There's only a handful of the people and the orgs who are going to do anything. So then, it should really not be squandered on all kinds of random subjects. Really, these few subjects are the core which should get precedence. So Amit, give us recommendations for today.
So I'll recommend the first book that comes to mind when you're talking about law and the powerful impact it can have and how every word matters. Code 2.0 by Lawrence Lessig, where he famously wrote about how, in a sense, a law is like code, that the way the rest of the machinery runs can be shaped by the law itself, and everything being under the shadow of the law, as it were. Ajay, what about you?
So I want to recommend a few things. Susan Thomas has an edited book of papers on the Indian bankruptcy reform. Gentle reader, there is work that is going on right now for a next edited book, which is a collection of papers. There is a meetup of the authors on the side of the emerging markets conference in December.
Which has already happened by the time you see this, but we are recording this before. So there you go.
So the attempt at trying to bring researchers together and build papers is afoot in this fashion. The second thing I will recommend is a movie. Okay, a movie of bank robbers, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.